The day I found what my grandfather Tobias hid beneath that rotting farmhouse floor, I realized why everyone in town had been so desperate to get their hands on his property. I'm talking about a discovery that turned me from the laughingstock of Cedar Junction, Nebraska, into the woman who made every single one of my doubters eat their words. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. My name is Ren Caldwell, and 6 months ago I was just another diesel mechanic trying to keep my repair shop afloat in Lincoln. Then my grandfather died and left me his 40-acre farmhouse, and suddenly every person in this tiny farming town had an opinion about what I should do with it. Problem was, none of those opinions included any respect for the woman who actually inherited the place. Picture this. I'm standing in the town bank wearing my work coveralls because I came straight from fixing a busted transmission, and the banker looks me up and down like I tracked mud through her pristine lobby. She slides a folder across her desk and says with this condescending smile, "Honey, farming isn't like fixing cars. Maybe you should consider Harrison Blackwood's offer before you get in over your head." That was my introduction to Cedar Junction, not welcome home or sorry for your loss, just immediate assumptions that I was too stupid, too inexperienced, and too female to handle what my grandfather left me. The local real estate agent started calling me within days of the funeral, practically salivating over the commission he'd make from what he called an inevitable sale to someone more suitable. They called me everything you can imagine. The mechanic, girl who thinks she can farm. The city slicker who doesn't understand rural life. The granddaughter who will run a perfectly good property into the ground because she's too proud to admit she's out of her league. At the hardware store, grown men would nudge each other and whisper loud enough for me to hear, "There goes that grease monkey again," pretending she knows what fertilizer to buy. But here's what none of them knew about my grandfather Tobias. He wasn't the failing farmer they all thought he was. He wasn't the old man who let his land go to waste because he was too stubborn to sell to developers. He was playing a game that was 20 years in the making, and I was about to become his final move. The morning I discovered what he really left me, I was crying in that kitchen because I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a stubborn fool trying to hang on to something I didn't understand. I had grease permanently stained under my fingernails. My bank account was nearly empty, and every person in town was waiting for me to fail so they could swoop in and claim what they thought should have been theirs all along. Little did they know, Grandpa Tobias had been watching every single one of them for decades. He knew exactly who showed their true character when they thought they were dealing with a helpless woman. And what I found buried beneath that barn floor didn't just change my life. It exposed every greedy, manipulative person who had underestimated both of us, and it gave me the power to make sure they never forgot the lesson. To understand how I ended up in this situation, you need to know that I wasn't supposed to inherit anything from my grandfather Tobias. My family had been fractured for 16 years, ever since my parents' messy divorce when I was 12. My mother Cordelia packed us up and moved to Lincoln, swearing she'd never set foot in Cedar Junction again, after what she called years of being judged by small-minded people who think women should know their place. The split wasn't just about the divorce. My grandfather had offered to help my parents financially during their rough patch, but my mother was too proud to accept what she saw as charity. She told Tobias that she didn't want his money if it came, with lectures about how she should be running her life. Their last conversation ended with him saying she was throwing away family for the sake of stubborn pride, and her screaming that he could keep his farmhouse and his outdated opinions. So, I grew up in the city learning about my grandfather only through the occasional birthday card with a $20 bill inside. My father, Decker, who worked as a heavy equipment mechanic for the city, taught me everything I knew about engines and hydraulics. He'd let me spend summers at his shop, showing me how to diagnose problems by sound and feel. "There's honest work in fixing things," he used to say while I handed him tools. "People will always need someone who can make broken things run again." By the time I was 25, I had saved enough to open my own repair shop specializing in diesel engines and farm equipment. It was small, just me and 2 part-time guys, but we built a reputation for being able to fix anything with an engine. The work was hard, the hours were long, And some customers still acted surprised when a woman in coveralls crawled under their truck to diagnose the problem. But it was mine, and I was proud of what I'd built. Then last year, everything started falling apart. A few big clients switched to a corporate chain that undercut my prices, and suddenly I was struggling to make rent on the shop. That's when my grandfather started calling. At first, I thought it was strange that this man I barely knew wanted to chat about my business troubles. But Tobias had this way of listening that made you feel like your problems mattered. "You're tougher than your mother thinks," he told me during one of our late-night phone calls. "She always assumed people were judging her, but sometimes you have to stop caring what others think and just focus on doing good work." He started sending me letters too, filled with stories about the early days of farming in Nebraska and how his own father had struggled to make their land profitable. Had no idea he was sick until my mother called me at the shop one Tuesday morning, her voice thick with tears. "Your grandfather had a heart attack. He's asking for you." The funeral was small, attended mostly by people who seemed more interested in discussing his property than mourning his passing. I stood at the graveside, feeling like I was saying goodbye to the only family member who had ever really understood what it meant to work with your hands. The reading of the will shocked everyone, especially me. While distant relatives expected to inherit portions of the property, Tobias left everything to me. The farmhouse, all 40 acres, the old barn, and what the lawyer described as any and all assets, discovered or undiscovered, contained therein. My mother was furious, convinced that I had somehow manipulated a sick old man. "You barely knew him," she said during our last conversation before I moved to Cedar Junction. "What makes you think you can handle something he spent his whole life building?" The property itself was exactly what you'd expect from a place that had been empty for 2 years. The 1920s farmhouse had good bones, but the white paint was peeling like old skin. The front porch sagged dangerously on one corner, and half the windows were covered with plastic sheeting. The barn was in slightly better condition, though pigeons had claimed most of the loft space. 40 acres of what used to be productive farmland had gone wild, with weeds as tall as my waist and fence lines that needed complete replacement. Standing in that empty house for the first time, surrounded by my grandfather's furniture covered in dust sheets, I felt the weight of what I'd inherited. This wasn't just a property. It was a responsibility I wasn't sure I was equipped to handle, and everyone in Cedar Junction seemed eager to remind me of that fact. But there was something else I felt in that quiet farmhouse. Something I couldn't quite name at the time. It was like my grandfather was still there, watching and waiting to see what I'd do with this second chance he'd given me. The mockery started before I even finished unpacking my truck. I was carrying a toolbox into the farmhouse when my neighbor Harrison Blackwood pulled up in his gleaming pickup. He didn't introduce himself or offer condolences. Instead, he looked me up and down and said, "You must be Tobias's granddaughter. I've been trying to buy this land for years. Your grandfather was too stubborn to see reason, but I'm hoping you're more practical." When I told him I wasn't interested in selling, his friendly mask slipped. "Little lady, this isn't the city. Farming requires knowledge that takes generations to develop. You'll be bankrupt within a year trying to make this work." He handed me his business card with a smug smile. "Call me when reality sets in." That conversation set the tone for everything that followed. At Peterson's Hardware, I tried to buy basic supplies to start repairs on the house. The clerk, Baxter Grimm, watched me like I was planning to shoplift while I selected paint and brushes. When I asked about bulk pricing, he snorted. "Bulk pricing is for real farmers, not weekend hobbyists playing dress-up in work clothes." He charged me retail price for everything, adding a 15% small quantity surcharge that I later learned he made up on the spot. The financial pressure started immediately. Iris Fontaine at the bank called within my first week asking me to come in for a consultation about your inherited obligations. She sat behind her mahogany desk in a crisp blazer, examining my credit report like it was contaminated. "Your grandfather owed substantial property taxes. The farmhouse needs major structural work to meet current codes. Without agricultural income, you're looking at expenses that will drain your savings within months." She spread out papers showing tax bills, insurance requirements, and maintenance estimates that made my stomach drop. Harrison Blackwood has made a generous offer of $180,000. That's more than this property will be worth after you factor in the money you'll lose trying to make it profitable. Her tone made it clear she thought I was naive for not jumping at the chance to sell. But the worst part was how the entire town seemed to view me as entertainment. At Morton's Diner, conversations would stop when I walked in, then resume in loud whispers clearly meant for me to overhear. "That mechanic girl thinks she can handle 40 acres, someone would say, followed by laughter. "Give her one winter, and she'll be begging someone to take it off her hands." Delilah Reeves, who owned the coffee shop, was particularly brutal. She'd greet me with fake sweetness, then launch into lectures about how farming wasn't a hobby you could pick up from YouTube videos. "Honey, your grandfather struggled with this land for decades and he actually knew what he was doing." "What? Makes you think you can succeed where he couldn't?" The breaking point came during a town council meeting about local development. I attended because I wanted to understand the community better, but Vernon Pritchard used my presence as an opportunity for public humiliation. He stood up with a presentation folder and announced, "We have an exciting opportunity for commercial development on the former Caldwell property. Since the current owner lacks agricultural experience, this land could serve the community better as retail space." The room erupted in approving murmurs. Someone shouted, "Finally, someone with sense." Another voice added, "Maybe she can open a car wash next to where the corn used to grow." The laughter was loud and cruel, with people turning to stare at me like I was part of the entertainment. I stood up, my face burning with embarrassment and anger. This meeting is supposed to be about community development, not about pressuring residents to sell their property. But Vernon wasn't finished. He smiled condescendingly and said, "Miss Caldwell, we're simply being realistic about what's best for everyone involved. Your grandfather's land has been unproductive for years. Perhaps it's time to admit that good intentions don't make up for lack of experience." I walked out of that meeting feeling smaller than I had since middle school, when kids would make fun of my second-hand clothes. But as I sat in my truck outside the community center, listening to continued laughter through the windows, something inside me shifted from hurt to determination. These people had made their opinions clear, and now I was going to prove every single one of them wrong. That night after the town meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing their laughter echoing in my head, seeing Vernon Pritchard's smug smile as he talked about my lack of experience. I wandered through the farmhouse, touching my grandfather's furniture, and wondering if maybe everyone was right. Maybe I was just a stubborn fool trying to hold on to something I didn't understand. I ended up in Tobias's bedroom, sitting on his old quilt and feeling sorry for myself. That's when I noticed something odd about his antique oak desk. One of the drawers seemed shorter than it should be, like there was a gap between the drawer and the back wall. I pulled it all the way out and ran my fingers along the back panel until I found a tiny latch hidden in the wood grain. The secret compartment opened with a soft click, and inside was an envelope with my name written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, and what I read changed everything. "My dear Wren," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then the vultures are circling and you're feeling overwhelmed. Don't let them break your spirit like they tried to break mine 40 years ago when I was young and people thought I didn't know what I was doing. The real treasure of this land isn't what grows on top of it, and it never was. These people have been so busy looking at dying crops that they never bothered to look beneath their feet." He went on to explain that everything he'd done for the past 20 years had been carefully planned. The neglected fields, the modest lifestyle, even the unpaid tax bills were all part of a strategy to make people think the land was worthless. "Look where the old oak tree cast its shadow at sunset on summer solstice," he wrote. "Count 13 paces north from the shadow's end, then dig beneath the barn's original foundation stones. What I've preserved there will secure your future, and silence every doubter who questioned your worth." The letter ended with words that made me cry. "You're stronger than your mother, smarter than your critics, and more deserving of respect than any of them will ever admit. Don't you dare let them convince you otherwise." I spent the next 2 days researching everything I could find about my grandfather's past. What I discovered shocked me. Old newspaper clippings from the county library showed that Tobias had been far more successful than anyone remembered. In the 1980s, he'd made smart investments in grain futures during a market boom. He'd quietly bought mineral rights to properties throughout the county when prices were low. The failing farmer image was completely intentional. I also found records showing that Harrison Blackwood's father had tried to buy our land multiple times over the decades, always being told no. That explained Harrison's determination to acquire the property now that he thought he was dealing with someone more naive than Tobias. On summer solstice, I waited until sunset and watched the oak tree's shadow stretch across the yard. When it reached its longest point, I marked the spot and counted 13 paces north, which brought me to the northeast corner of the old barn. The foundation stones there looked different from the others, slightly newer and not quite settled into the ground the same way. I rented a metal detector and some heavy digging equipment, telling the rental guy I was looking for old farm tools my grandfather might have buried. Harrison Blackwood drove by twice that day, slowing down to stare at me with obvious suspicion. The second time, he actually stopped and got out of his truck. "What exactly are you looking for out there?" he demanded. "If there's something valuable on this land, potential buyers have a right to know about it." I kept working and told him I was just clearing debris, but inside my heart was pounding because the metal detector was going crazy in that exact spot. Something big was buried 4 feet down, right where my grandfather said it would be. I waited until the middle of the night to start digging, working by flashlight so nobody would see what I was doing. The physical work felt good after days of feeling helpless and humiliated. Every shovel of dirt I moved felt like I was taking back control of my life. At 4 in the morning, my shovel hit something solid. The metallic clang echoed through the quiet barn, and I had to stop digging to catch my breath. My hands were blistered and my back ached, but I had never been more focused in my life. Whatever my grandfather had buried here was about to change everything. I carefully cleared the dirt away until I could see the outline of a large metal container, about the size of a toolbox, but much heavier. It took all my strength to lift it out of the hole and carry it into the farmhouse kitchen. The container was sealed with heavy-duty latches and wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof material. Tobias had gone to serious lengths to protect whatever was inside. My hands trembled as I opened the latches. The first thing I saw was another letter from my grandfather, sitting on top of everything else like he knew I'd need his encouragement one more time. But underneath that letter were 3 items that made my legs go weak. The first was a key to a safety deposit box at the Cedar Junction Bank, along with documentation showing the box had been paid for 20 years in advance. The second was a folder containing land survey reports that proved our property sat directly on top of a natural gas deposit. The geological surveys were official, signed by state-certified engineers, and estimated the gas rights alone were worth $15 to $20 million over the next decade. The third item was a portfolio of stock certificates for companies. I recognized companies that had become incredibly valuable over the past 30 years. My grandfather had been quietly investing his farming profits for decades, buying shares when prices were low and holding on to them as they grew. Conservative estimates put the portfolio value at over $3 million. But there was one more thing in that container that made everything click into place. Tobias had kept detailed records of every conversation, every lowball offer, and every insult he'd endured from people in town. He had documentation of Harrison Blackwood's father trying to pressure him into selling in the 1990s. He had recorded phone calls of Vernon Pritchard discussing plans to rezone agricultural land for commercial development. He even had notes about Iris Fontaine's attempts to manipulate property tax assessments to force sales. His final letter explained everything. The gas rights alone will make you wealthier than every person who looked down on our family combined. But more importantly, you'll have the power to choose who deserves your respect. These people showed their true character when they thought they were dealing with a helpless woman. Now you can show them what real power looks like. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, staring at those documents in disbelief, when I heard car doors slamming outside. It was barely sunrise, but somehow word had gotten out that I'd been digging near the barn. Through the window, I could see Harrison Blackwood marching up to my front porch with Vernon Pritchard and 2 other men I didn't recognize. Harrison pounded on the door like he owned the place. "We know you found something out there," he shouted. "If there are valuable assets on this property, you have a legal obligation to disclose them to potential buyers." I walked to the front door still wearing my dirt-covered clothes from digging all night, and opened it to face four men who thought they could intimidate me into giving up what was rightfully mine. But for the first time since I'd arrived in Cedar Junction, I wasn't afraid of them. "You're right, Harrison," I said calmly. "I did find something. I found proof that my grandfather was smarter than all of you combined, and that every single person in this town who tried to pressure me into selling was trying to steal something worth millions." The look on Harrison's face when I said millions was worth every humiliation I'd endured. Vernon Pritchard actually took a step backward. But I wasn't finished with them yet. I had 40 years of family dignity to restore, and I was just getting started.
The news of my discovery spread through Cedar Junction faster than a grass fire. By noon that same day, my phone was ringing non-stop with calls from energy companies wanting to negotiate leasing agreements for the gas rights. Harrison Blackwood's final offer came through Vernon Pritchard, who called stuttering about revised market assessments and mutually beneficial arrangements. They were offering $2 million for land. They'd tried to pressure me into selling for $180,000 just weeks before. I let that offer sit on my kitchen table while I drove to the bank to open Tobias's safety deposit box. Iris Fontaine met me at the door with a nervous smile, suddenly calling me Miss Caldwell instead of Honey. The box contained even more documentation of my grandfather's investments, including shares in 3 different energy companies that had been drilling in our county for the past 5 years. He'd been collecting royalty checks and reinvesting them for decades. But the most satisfying discovery was a folder labeled "For Wren's Future." Inside were copies of every conversation Tobias had recorded with people trying to buy his land. Harrison's father threatening to have the property condemned for unpaid taxes. Vernon Pritchard discussing plans to manipulate zoning laws. Even Baxter Grimm from the hardware store bragging about overcharging city people who didn't know better. The confrontation with Harrison came 3 days later when he showed up at my door without his usual entourage. Gone was the condescending smile and the little lady attitude. He stood on my porch, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd realized he'd been outsmarted by someone he'd underestimated. "I want to apologize for any misunderstandings," he said, his voice lacking its usual swagger. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Your grandfather was clearly more astute than any of us realized." I looked at this man who'd spent months trying to intimidate me into giving up my inheritance, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, but pity. "Harrison," I said, "you never bothered to learn my name before you found out I was wealthy. You never asked about my grandfather's health or offered help when I was struggling. You saw a woman you thought was weak, and you tried to take advantage of her. That says everything about your character that I need to know." The real change came in how people treated me around town. Baxter Grimm suddenly couldn't do enough to help me, offering contractor discounts and apologizing for any confusion about previous charges. Delilah Reeves invited me to join the Chamber of Commerce, acting like we'd been friends all along. Even Iris Fontaine offered me premium banking services and investment advice. But their changed attitudes taught me something more valuable than any treasure my grandfather could have buried. Respect that depends on how much money you have isn't really respect at all. The people whose opinions actually mattered were the ones who'd treated me decently when they thought I was just a struggling mechanic trying to honor her grandfather's memory. I decided not to sell the farmhouse. Instead, I used part of my newfound wealth to renovate it completely and establish something my grandfather would have been proud of: the Tobias Caldwell Center for Women in Trades. The facility now trains young women in mechanics, welding, carpentry, and sustainable agriculture. Every girl who walks through our doors learns that their worth isn't determined by other people's expectations. Standing in my fully restored farmhouse 6 months later, watching a group of teenage girls learning to rebuild engines in the renovated barn, I finally understood what my grandfather's real gift had been. It wasn't the money or the gas rights or even the satisfaction of proving my doubters wrong. It was the lesson that sometimes the very things people mock you for become your greatest strengths. I still have grease under my fingernails, I still wear work coveralls more often than dresses, and I still believe that there's honor in fixing things that are broken. The difference is that now I know my worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval, and I'm teaching the next generation of women the same lesson. My grandfather didn't just leave me wealthy. He taught me that true treasure isn't what you inherit, it's what you do with the opportunities you're given.